Hello everyone, today I'm going to review the Panasonic FZ300 Super Zoom camera. This is a camera that goes from 25mm to 600mm. So this is basically a super zoom camera and I'm going to review it for bird photography. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on the 600mm focal length, but I've tested this camera at various focal lengths against various other lenses and camera combinations, and I've tested its autofocus, and I'm going to tell you sort of how this camera performs and is it worth it for bird photography. I'm going to talk about the build quality. Okay, the build quality of this camera is okay, but it's not great. Some of the knobs and the switches are a little bit tight, like the scroll wheel knob to change the aperture or shutter speed. It's a little bit hard to turn. And actually this camera had a bit of a problem when taking photos with the mechanical shutter, and it showed some very strange malfunctions, like odd and strange patterns on the screen. So the build quality of this camera is a little bit iffy. Okay, this camera shoots RAW, and it has all the basic modes. It has aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, and manual mode. And it has manual mode with auto ISO. Now the only one thing I would say about this camera that's not that good is that in the manual mode with auto ISO, you can't control the exposure compensation without changing the ISO manually. So once you turn the ISO to auto, you cannot control the exposure compensation. Let's get on to the image quality and how it performs. So this camera has a equivalent focal length of 25mm to 600mm. So basically it's using a 100mm lens to accomplish the 600mm field of view by using a fairly small sensor. And the sensor is 6.5mm to 4.9mm approximately. And it uses this small sensor, as you can see, with a 100mm lens to accomplish a 600mm field of view. Now, I was actually surprised at how much image quality you can get out of a 100mm lens on the small sensor. It has a 12 megapixel sensor, and you might think that 12 megapixels is not really that good, but actually I think 12 megapixels was a good choice for this sensor because any more megapixels would have resulted probably in not really usable pixels, too much noise, and larger file size. So the 12 megapixels was kind of a good compromise for this camera because it does have such a small sensor, and it does make the camera very compact, but there's a bit of trade-off in image quality. So that means you are going to face some compromises when it comes to using this camera, especially at longer focal lengths. I found that even at ISO 400 and ISO 800, I can see quite a bit of noise in these shots, and you are losing a little bit of detail compared to using a longer lens on a larger sensor camera. But you do get a very compact camera to achieve a 600mm field of view. Now, how good is the image quality exactly? Well, I actually compared this camera against several different lens combinations. I compared it against a 40-150mm lens on micro four thirds. I also compared it against a 300mm lens on full frame. And I compared it against my Nikon 500mm f5.6 PF lens on my Nikon D500. So you can get a kind of approximate idea of the image quality with this camera. So let's start. The first comparison was with the 40mm to 150mm f4 to 5.6 lens on micro four thirds. Now that's a kit lens, and it doesn't perform very well, and it's not a very good lens, but it does have technically more focal length than the actual focal length of the lens of the Panasonic FZ300. Now, from this comparison, you can see that the Panasonic FZ300 definitely does a better job than 150mm on the 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor of the Panasonic G9. So if you're trying to choose between this camera and a 150mm lens on a micro four thirds camera, then this camera is still going to do a better job. And that's pretty good. The next, I put a 300mm lens on my Nikon Z6. Now this was a DX lens, so it was shot in DX mode. And in DX mode, I'm getting about 12 megapixels on the Nikon Z6 with a 300mm lens. At these pictures, the comparison is a little more close. We are using a 300mm lens versus a 100mm lens. And it seems that the 300mm results are fairly close with some edge and detail given to the FZ300. I think on the Nikon D500, an APS-C camera with 20 megapixels, these results would be fairly equal. So what this means is probably if you took a 300mm lens, a better 300mm lens like a 300mm prime, and put it on a DX camera, an APS-C camera, it would probably perform a little bit better or about equal to the 100mm lens or the 600mm equivalent field of view on the Panasonic FZ300. The final test was the comparison, which is quite unfair, between the Panasonic FZ300 and the Nikon 500mm f5.6 lens on the Nikon D500. You can see that the 500mm f5.6 PF lens clearly resolves a lot more detail than the Panasonic FZ300. But what this means is that if you're going to use a lens that's 400mm or more on a micro four thirds camera or an APS-C camera, you're going to get more detail than the Panasonic FZ300. But of course, then you're using a camera that's a lot bigger, more expensive, and a lot larger in terms of physical dimensions. So you do kind of have to go past the 300mm range to get significantly more detail and reach on an interchangeable lens camera compared to the Panasonic FZ300. I also tested the Panasonic FZ300 at various apertures at pretty much all focal lengths. I tested it at 25mm, like 40mm, 100mm, etc. at f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8. I'll show you one sample here at 500mm, but the results are pretty much the same for all focal lengths. And that is, this camera is sharpest at f4 and very close to f4 at f2.8. But the sharpness drops off significantly at f5.6 and even more so at f8. So with this camera, I think you're already seeing quite a lot of softness and diffraction at f5.6. And so whenever possible, it's best to keep this camera at f4 or f2.8. Now, in terms of image quality, sharpness is not the only thing. You also need a decent autofocus system to get good results. And this camera uses Panasonic's older depth from defocus focusing technology. It doesn't use phase detect autofocus. So what that means is the autofocus isn't going to be as fast as in some other super zooms, maybe like the Nikon P1000, and you're going to get a little bit slower autofocus. Now, I did find it to be fairly accurate, and it's fairly good in brighter situations. But I think that the autofocus on this camera is something to consider. It's not going to be as good as some of the other super zooms. So my conclusion about the autofocus is that the depth from defocus autofocus is okay, but it's not great. And also, it works very well in single focus, autofocus single, but it's not very good at tracking. So you're not going to be capturing birds in flight with this camera very easily. You can do it, but it's not going to be very easy. Okay, so now let's talk about the video on the Panasonic FZ300. And to talk about the video, I've switched over to the Panasonic FZ300 to record this video. You'll see that the video is a little bit different. Before I was using the Panasonic G9 to record the video. Now it's the FZ300. So the FZ300 is pretty decent at video. It's got 1080p and 4K modes. You can shoot at 60 frames per second in HD or 30 frames in 4K mode. It's got a high-speed mode that only operates in HD or VGA mode. So you've got 120 frames per second in HD and 240 frames per second in VGA. And those are actually pretty useful for taking slow motion video of birds or other things that you might want to take video of. Who would want to take a video of things besides birds? I know. Anyway, and it's also got an articulating screen. So you can shoot at unusual levels, like you can bring your camera down and shoot at ground level. And the articulating screen is also useful for vlogging. So that's another thing that's cool. Now you've got a little bit of control over the video too. You can shoot in automatic mode, shutter priority mode, or aperture priority mode, or even manual mode. The only problem with manual mode is you can't set the ISO to be auto ISO in manual mode. So if you want to shoot in manual, you're going to have to set your ISO manually. You've also got some good control over the picture styles. You can set the picture profile to be things like natural, vivid, or flat, or monochrome. And you do have custom modes, which means you can set the contrast, sharpness, and noise reduction of your video picture profile modes. Now, I did find that the picture profiles, even the contrast set at the least amount of contrast, weren't as flat as in the Panasonic G9. So you can't get very flat footage with this camera, but it does help to set your contrast to the lowest in the custom picture modes. Now, the other thing about video is the stabilization system. The stabilization system on the video is not extremely good. You will get a fair amount of jitter shooting with this camera. So if you're shooting at a very long focal length, like 600 millimeters, you might want to stabilize your camera with a tripod, but that's not too unusual because pretty much any camera shooting at 600 millimeters is going to have some jitter if you're trying to handhold the camera. That said, you can get usable footage at longer focal lengths with the stabilization system. Okay, so what's my conclusion about this camera? I think this camera is a pretty good camera. It's good for the price, but it does have some build quality issues that I'm concerned about. It has decent but not class-leading autofocus. It's good for still subjects, but not necessarily moving ones, or at least not fast-moving ones. The sharpness is okay, and it's about equivalent to using a 300mm lens on an APS-C camera or a high-density full-frame camera or a Micro Four Thirds camera. So I liked using this camera. It was a good camera, and it's very compact, and those are some good qualities about it. Just beware of its limitations in terms of its sharpness and in terms of its autofocus.